She had one night to choose a husband or watch her entire life collapse. The Hayes estate had always been a symbol of quiet dominance. It stood on a stretch of elevated land just outside the city, surrounded by acres of controlled beauty, gardens trimmed with precision, pathways designed with intention, and architecture that reflected not just wealth but legacy. Everything about the estate carried the weight of history. And for most of her life, Scarlett Hayes had believed that history meant security. That belief ended the moment she was called into the study. The room itself had not changed, dark with shelves lined with records of decades-old deals. A desk positioned in the center, like a point of command, soft lighting that created an atmosphere of calm authority. It had always been a place where decisions were made, quietly, strategically, without room for emotion. But tonight, something felt different. Not in the room. In the silence, Scarlett stepped inside with controlled composure, her posture straight, her expression neutral. She had been raised to carry herself this way, to reflect control even when she didn't feel it. Her appearance matched the environment she had grown up in, refined, polished, deliberate. Her dark hair fell neatly over her shoulders, her outfit elegant yet understated. Chosen not to attract attention, but to command quiet respect. But the moment her eyes met her father's, she understood something was wrong. That was the emotional hook, because the people who teach you control are often the first ones to break it. Richard Hayes did not greet her the way he normally would. There was no measured acknowledgement, no calm introduction to whatever conversation was about to take place. Instead, he stood near the desk, his posture rigid, his expression unusually tense. And beside him sat people who did not belong in that room. Men she did not recognize, not family associates, not business partners she had seen before. Their presence was quiet, but heavy, the kind of presence that did not need to speak to be understood. They were not there to discuss. They were there to ensure something happened. Scarlett's awareness sharpened instantly, because this was not a conversation. This was a situation. She moved further into the room, her step steady, her gaze briefly scanning the unfamiliar faces before returning to her father. She did not ask questions immediately. She didn't need to, because whatever this was, it was already decided. "Sit," Richard said. His tone was calm, but beneath it was pressure. Scarlett obeyed without hesitation, taking the seat opposite his desk. Her movements remained controlled, but internally, her thoughts were aligning rapidly, analyzing every detail, every inconsistency, because something about this moment did not fit. And when things don't fit, they reveal truth. Richard exhaled slowly, as if preparing himself for something that required more effort than usual. That alone was enough to shift Scarlett's understanding, because her father did not struggle with decisions. He made them, without hesitation. "Everything we built," he began, his voice measured, "is at risk." The statement landed with quiet weight. Scarlett didn't react outwardly, but internally everything paused, because statements like that are never said lightly. "What does that mean?" she asked. Her voice remained calm, controlled, but direct. Richard's gaze held hers for a moment before shifting slightly, almost as if avoiding something. "Debt," he said. One word. Simple, but devastating. Scarlett's mind processed it immediately, but something about it didn't align. The Hayes family did not fall into debt. Not unknowingly. Not without preparation. Not without control. Which meant this wasn't accidental. "How?" she asked. But this time there was no answer. Not directly. Because the truth was not something he wanted to explain. And that was the intellectual hook. Because the most dangerous situations are not the ones caused by mistakes, but the ones created by decisions no one wants to admit. Scarlett's gaze shifted briefly toward the men in the room before returning to her father. "This isn't just financial," she said. Not a question, a realization. Richard didn't deny it, which confirmed everything. The room grew quieter, not because sound disappeared, but because meaning increased. Every word now carried weight beyond its surface. Every second stretched with consequence. "We have one option," Richard continued. And in that moment, Scarlett understood, not the details, but the direction. Because one option never means choice. It means pressure. "What option?" she asked. Her voice remained steady. But now it carried something else. Awareness. Richard's hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough, because hesitation means conflict, and conflict means truth. You need to get married. The words were delivered calmly, as if they were reasonable, as if they were expected, as if they made sense. Scarlett did not move, did not react, did not speak, because sometimes the most powerful response is silence. But inside, everything shifted, because this was not a suggestion. It was a solution, and solutions like this are never about happiness. They are about survival. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her mind connecting fragments quickly now. Who? She asked, because that was the only question that mattered. Richard's gaze held hers, and for the first time, there was something in it she had never seen before. Not authority, not certainty. Something closer to resignation. Dante Moretti. The name landed like impact, not because she had met him, but because she knew it. Everyone did. Not publicly, not openly, but enough. Dante Moretti was not just a man. He was influence, power, control operating outside the boundaries most people understood. And in that moment, everything became clear. This wasn't marriage. This was a transaction. That was the emotional hook. Because the moment love is replaced by strategy, marriage becomes a contract, not a choice. Scarlett leaned back slightly, her composure still intact, but her thoughts no longer steady. "You're asking me to fix this," she said. Again, not a question. A fact. Richard didn't deny it, because he couldn't. Yes. One word. Final. Irreversible. Scarlett's gaze dropped briefly to the desk before lifting again. "And if I don't?" The question was simple, but its meaning was not. The room shifted slightly, not visibly, but in presence, because now the truth had to be spoken. Richard's expression hardened just enough to reveal what he had been holding back. "Then we lose everything." The words were calm, but absolute. Scarlett understood immediately. The estate, the business, the legacy, everything tied to the Hayes name gone. Not slowly, not over time, completely. And in that realization, something inside her broke, not visibly, but deeply, because this was not just pressure. This was betrayal. That was the emotional hook. Because the hardest choices are not forced by enemies, they are forced by the people you trust. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged, but her perception of everything around her had shifted completely. The room was no longer familiar. It was strategic. Her father was no longer protective. He was calculating. And she was no longer a daughter. She was a solution. Scarlett stood slowly, her movements controlled, her expression calm, but her eyes had changed, not emotional, not broken, focused, because now she understood the situation fully. And understanding changes everything. "How long?" she asked. Richard didn't hesitate this time. "Until midnight." The answer came quickly, because the timeline was already decided. Scarlett nodded once, not in agreement, in acknowledgement, because she knew something now with absolute clarity. This was not a choice between marriage and freedom. It was a choice between sacrifice and destruction. And both came with consequences. She turned without another word, moving toward the door with the same composed precision she had walked in with. But this time, everything was different, because now she was not leaving as Scarlett Hayes, daughter of a powerful family. She was leaving as someone who had just been given a deadline, a decision, a life-altering moment, compressed into hours. And as she stepped out of the room, the weight of it settled fully into place, because by midnight, she had to become his wife, or lose everything she had ever loved. He wasn't offering marriage. He was offering control. The time between the ultimatum and the meeting did not feel like hours. It felt like compression. Every second carried weight. Every thought sharpened by urgency. Scarlett Hayes did not return to her room. She did not seek comfort, nor did she attempt to delay what had already been set in motion. Because delay, she understood now, was not part of the structure she had been placed inside. This was not negotiation. This was execution. By the time the car arrived, the sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the Hayes estate. The environment that had once felt permanent now seemed fragile, almost temporary, as if it could disappear at any moment. Scarlett stepped into the car without hesitation, her posture composed, her expression controlled. But internally, her awareness had reached a level of clarity she had never experienced before, because this was not just about survival anymore. This was about understanding the force she was about to face. That was the intellectual hook, because you cannot survive power until you understand how it operates. The drive was silent. No explanations, no reassurances, only movement towards something inevitable. The city shifted gradually as they moved deeper into its center. Familiar districts gave way to controlled spaces, areas where presence was not public, but known, buildings that did not advertise importance, but carried it in silence. And then they stopped. The building itself was not extravagant. That was the first thing Scarlett noticed. No excessive display of wealth, no unnecessary design, just structure, clean, intentional, controlled, which meant this place was not built to impress. It was built to function, and places like that belonged to people who did not need validation. Scarlett stepped out of the car, her heels meeting the ground with quiet precision. Her gaze moved once across the building before returning forward, because she understood something now. Every detail here was deliberate. She was led inside without a word. The interior matched the exterior, minimal, controlled, efficient. No wasted space. No decorative distractions. Every element served a purpose. Even the silence felt structured, and at the center of it was him, Dante Moretti. He was not surrounded by noise, not guarded by visible chaos. He stood alone, and that made him more dangerous. Scarlett saw him before he acknowledged her. Tall, composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that carried no excess, only precision. His posture was relaxed, but not casual, controlled. His presence did not demand attention. It absorbed it. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous people are not the loudest. They are the ones who never need to raise their voice. When his gaze finally met hers, there was no hesitation, no curiosity, no assessment, because assessment had already happened. That realization hit instantly. He already knew, not just her name, everything. Scarlett stepped forward, her movement steady, her expression unchanged. Because if this was a game of control, she would not begin by losing hers. They stood across from each other, the space between them measured, deliberate. No introductions were made. None were needed, because this meeting was not about identity. It was about terms. You understand why you're here. His voice was calm, not cold, not aggressive, but certain. Scarlett held his gaze. Yes. Her answer was simple, because complexity would not benefit her here. Dante studied her for a brief moment, not in a way that felt invasive, but precise, as if confirming something he already believed to be true. And then he nodded, not in approval, in acknowledgement, because she had met expectation. That was the intellectual hook, because when someone already expects your reaction, it means they've already studied your mind. Scarlett felt it clearly now. This was not a man she could read easily, because he did not express. He calculated. There are no misunderstandings between us, he said. Again, not a question. A structure. Scarlett's gaze didn't shift. Then there's nothing to clarify. Her response was measured, controlled, and for a brief second, something changed. Not in him visibly, but in the space between them. Because she had not responded with hesitation. She had aligned, and alignment is not expected from someone under pressure. That made her different. Dante turned slightly, moving toward the table behind him, not to distance himself, but to shift the structure of the interaction, because standing face to face creates tension, and tension is not always useful. He placed a file on the table, sliding it forward just enough to indicate its importance. The Hayes debt, he said. 2 words. Enough to shift everything. Scarlett stepped closer, her attention moving to the file without immediately opening it, because information is never neutral. It is controlled. What about it? She asked. Dante's gaze remained steady. It exists because of a decision your family made. The statement was calm, but intentional. Scarlett's eyes narrowed slightly. Then they should fix it. Dante did not react, because reaction would suggest emotion, and emotion was not part of the structure. They can't. Again, simple. Final, which meant this situation had already moved beyond correction. Scarlett opened the file slowly, her eyes scanning the contents with precision. Numbers, agreements, transfers, but more importantly, patterns. And within those patterns, something became clear. This was not just debt, this was leverage. That was the intellectual hook, because money creates problems, but leverage controls people. Scarlett closed the file, her gaze lifting back to him. You're not solving this, she said. Dante's expression remained unchanged. No, a single word, honest, which made it more dangerous. You're using it. This time, he didn't respond immediately, because that statement was accurate. And accuracy does not need confirmation. Scarlett exhaled slowly, her mind aligning further. This isn't marriage. Her voice remained calm, but now it carried clarity. Dante met her gaze fully. No, again, honest. And in that moment, everything settled, because now there were no illusions left, no false expectations, no hidden meanings. This was not about partnership. It was about structure, control, positioning. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous agreements are not the ones built on lies, but the ones built on truth you cannot escape. Scarlett's posture remained steady, but internally, her understanding had shifted completely. He wasn't offering her safety. He was placing her inside his system. And once inside, there was no independence, only roles. You already knew I would say yes, she said, not as a question, as a realization. Dante did not deny it. Yes, the answer came without hesitation, because prediction was part of his strategy. Scarlett's gaze held his, sharper now. How? This time, he gave more than a single word. Because you don't have a choice. The statement was simple, but absolute, and in that moment, she understood something deeper. This was not manipulation. This was design. He had not created the situation. He had positioned himself to control it. That was the intellectual hook. Because true power is not forcing decisions. It is creating situations where decisions make themselves. Scarlett stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in recalibration, because now she knew exactly what she was facing. Not a man, a system. And systems are harder to fight than people. Her final realization settled quietly, but firmly. He did not need to convince her, did not need to threaten her, did not need to force anything, because everything around her was already doing that. And as the silence between them stretched, filled with understanding rather than confusion, one truth became undeniable. He didn't need to threaten her, because the choice itself was already a trap. The contract looked like paper, but it felt like a cage. The silence that followed their understanding was not empty. It was structured. Scarlett Hayes stood in a space where nothing needed to be explained anymore, because everything had already been defined. The distance between her and Dante Moretti no longer carried uncertainty. It carried clarity, cold, precise, and irreversible. This was no longer about whether she would accept. It was about how she would exist after she did. That was the intellectual hook, because the most dangerous agreements are not the ones you are forced into, but the ones you fully understand before signing. Dante moved first, not with urgency, but with intention. He reached for a second file placed beside the first, its edges sharp, its structure clean. There was nothing careless about it, nothing rushed. He placed it on the table between them. No explanation, no introduction, because contracts like this did not require persuasion. They required acknowledgement. Scarlett's gaze lowered toward the document, but she did not reach for it immediately, because she understood something now. This paper was not just terms. It was transformation. Her life before it, and her life after it, would not be the same. She stepped forward slowly, her hand finally resting on the edge of the document. Her movements remained controlled, but internally, her awareness sharpened even further, because every word inside this contract would define her position, not just legally. Strategically, she opened it. The pages were precise, organized, structured in a way that reflected the same discipline as everything else connected to him. No unnecessary language, no emotional framing, only terms. Clear, direct, unavoidable. Scarlett read carefully, her eyes moving across each line with measured focus. Protection. The word appeared early, defined in legal structure, reinforced through authority, backed by resources she could not fully quantify, but understood enough to recognize its weight. Her safety would be guaranteed, not requested, enforced. Debt clearance followed. Every financial burden tied to the Hayes name, removed, not delayed, not negotiated, eliminated completely. And then, family security, the estate, the business, the legacy, all preserved, untouched, as if the threat had never existed. Scarlett's fingers tightened slightly against the paper, because on the surface, this looked like salvation, but beneath it was something else entirely. That was the emotional hook, because when something offers you everything you need, you have to ask what it's taking in return. Her gaze continued downward, and that was when she noticed it. Not immediately obvious, not clearly defined, but present, conditions, not written as restrictions, but structured as expectations. Her movements, her public presence, her alignment with his authority. Everything outlined carefully, but not emphasized, because emphasis would make it visible, and visibility would invite resistance. Scarlett's breathing remained steady, but internally, everything aligned with sharper clarity. This was not protection. This was control, disguised as structure. That was the intellectual hook, because control is most effective when it feels like safety. She closed the document slowly, her gaze lifting back to Dante. "You've already decided how this works," she said. Not a question, a conclusion. Dante did not respond immediately, because her statement was accurate, and accuracy does not require confirmation. "You'll have everything you need," he said. His voice remained calm, measured, but it did not answer her statement. It redirected it, which meant he had no intention of denying it. Scarlett exhaled slowly, her posture unchanged, her expression controlled. "This isn't partnership," she said. Dante's gaze remained steady. "No." Again, honest. And that honesty made it heavier, because there was no illusion left to hold on to. No version of this where she could pretend it was something else. She was not entering a marriage. She was entering a system. And within that system, she would have a role, defined, limited, controlled. That was the emotional hook. Because losing freedom doesn't always feel like loss. Sometimes it feels like agreement. Scarlett stepped back slightly, creating space, not physically, but mentally. Because now, she had everything she needed to decide. Not emotionally, strategically, and strategy required clarity. The door behind her opened quietly. She did not turn immediately. She didn't need to, because she already knew who it was. Her father. Richard Hayes entered with the same controlled presence he had always carried. But now, there was something else beneath it. Urgency, not visible, but real. He moved closer, his attention shifting briefly to the document before settling on Scarlett. "You've seen it," he said. Again, not a question. Scarlett turned slightly, her gaze meeting his. "Yes." Her response was calm, but it carried weight, because now they both understood what this meant. "This is the only way," he added. The words were familiar, predictable, but now they felt different, because she could see the truth behind them. This was not the only way. It was a chosen way. That was the intellectual hook, because no choice is often just a version of reality someone else decided for you. Scarlett studied him for a moment, not as a daughter, but as someone analyzing a decision. "You already agreed," she said. Not accusing, not emotional, just precise. Richard did not deny it, because denial would not change anything now. "Yes." One word, final, Scarlett felt it fully, because this was the moment everything shifted, not when the ultimatum was given, not when she met Dante, but now, when she realized this had been decided before she entered the room. She had not been asked, she had been placed. That was the emotional hook, because the hardest betrayals are not loud, they are planned in silence. Her gaze returned to the contract, the pages that now felt heavier than before, because now they carried more than terms. They carried intention, expectation, control, and yet they also carried something else. Solution. Her family would survive. The estate would remain. Everything she had grown up believing was permanent would stay intact, but only if she accepted, only if she signed. Scarlett reached for the pen placed neatly beside the document, her fingers wrapped around it with steady precision. No hesitation, no visible doubt, because hesitation would not change the outcome. It would only delay it. Her final thought aligned with quiet clarity. This was not about what she wanted. It was about what she was willing to sacrifice. And sacrifice had already been decided. She signed. The movement was smooth, controlled, final. The ink settled into the paper, marking a decision that could not be reversed. The room remained silent, because nothing needed to be said. Everything had already been done. Scarlett placed the pen down carefully, her posture straight, her expression unchanged. But internally, something had shifted permanently, because she had not just agreed to terms. She had accepted a new reality, one where freedom was no longer undefined. It was limited, structured, controlled. Dante closed the file without urgency, as if confirming something expected, not satisfaction, not victory, completion, because for him, this was never uncertain. Scarlett's gaze met his one last time, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, because now they were aligned, not equally, but definitively. And as the silence settled once more, carrying the weight of everything that had just been decided, one final realization surfaced quietly. She signed to save her family. But the contract had one condition no one explained. There were flowers, witnesses, and vows, but no happiness. Midnight did not arrive suddenly. It approached with precision. Every second leading up to it carried weight, as if time itself had been structured to deliver Scarlett Hayes into a moment she could not escape. The hours after signing the contract had not been filled with preparation in the traditional sense. There had been no celebration, no emotional anticipation, no sense of transition into something meaningful. Only movement, controlled, directed, and by the time the clock neared midnight, everything was already in place. That was the intellectual hook, because some weddings are not events. They are executions of decisions already made. The venue was not public. It did not exist to be seen. Hidden within one of the private properties controlled by Dante Moretti, the location reflected the same philosophy that defined everything connected to him. Precision without excess. The space itself was undeniably luxurious. Polished marble floors reflected soft lighting that had been carefully adjusted to create warmth, but the warmth felt artificial. Tall arrangements of white flowers lined the aisle, their placement symmetrical, flawless, untouched by imperfection. Every detail had been handled with care. And yet, something was missing. Emotion. The room did not feel like a place where two lives were joining. It felt like a place where two forces were aligning. Scarlett stood at the entrance, her posture straight, her expression calm, her presence composed in a way that had become second nature to her. Her dress reflected elegance, but not extravagance. Long sleeves, structured design, no unnecessary exposure. It was not designed to express personality. It was designed to present control. Her reflection in the mirrored panel beside her did not look unfamiliar, but it did not look like her either, because this version of Scarlett Hayes was not a woman walking toward a future. She was a decision being carried forward. That was the emotional hook, because sometimes people don't walk down the aisle for love. They walk because there is no other direction left. Behind her, quiet movement continued. Staff adjusted final details. Security maintained invisible boundaries. Every part of the environment functioned with purpose. No one spoke unnecessarily, because this was not a celebration. It was a process. Her father stood at a distance, his posture controlled, his expression unreadable. He did not approach her. He did not offer reassurance, because reassurance would suggest doubt, and doubt was not allowed here. Scarlett did not look at him again, because she already understood everything she needed to. The music began, not loud, not emotional, but measured, a signal, not a feeling. Scarlett stepped forward. Each step was precise, balanced, deliberate. The aisle stretched ahead of her, lined with people who were not there to celebrate her. They were there to witness. Observers. Participants in a system larger than the moment itself. Their expressions carried no warmth, only awareness, because they understood what this was. Not a union, a transaction. At the end of the aisle stood Dante Moretti, unmoving, unshaken, unchanged. His presence remained exactly as it had been when she first saw him. Controlled, composed, unaffected by the weight of the moment. He did not watch her with anticipation. He observed her arrival as a confirming a step in a process that had already been decided. That was the intellectual hook. Because when emotions are removed from a moment like this, what remains is pure strategy. Scarlett reached the end of the aisle and stopped. No hesitation, no visible reaction, because this was not the moment to feel. It was the moment to complete. The officiant began speaking, but the words did not carry meaning, not in the way they were meant to. Vows were spoken, not from the heart, from obligation, legal, structured, necessary. Scarlett's voice remained steady as she repeated what was required of her. Each word delivered with clarity, but without attachment, because attachment would create weakness. Dante's voice followed, equally calm, equally precise. No emotion, no hesitation, only confirmation. That was the emotional hook, because when vows are spoken without feeling, they become agreements, not promises. The rings were exchanged, cold metal resting against skin, a symbol that traditionally carried meaning. But here, it carried authority. Scarlett felt it settle against her finger, not as a connection, but as a marker, a line crossed, a position defined. She was no longer Scarlett Hayes, not in the way she had been before. She was now part of something else, something structured, something controlled, something far more powerful and far more dangerous. The officiant declared them married. The words echoed briefly through the room before dissolving into silence. No applause followed, no celebration, only acknowledgement, because everyone present understood what had just happened. This was not the beginning of a relationship. It was the activation of an arrangement. That was the intellectual hook, because sometimes a moment that should feel like a beginning is actually the point where everything changes irreversibly. Scarlett did not move immediately. Neither did Dante. For a brief moment, they stood side by side, not connected but aligned. And in that alignment, something became clear. He controlled the space. Completely, not visibly, not aggressively, but absolutely. The way people positioned themselves, the way attention shifted, the way silence was maintained, all of it responded to him. Scarlett recognized it instantly, because power like that does not need to be displayed. It exists in influence, and influence shapes reality. Dante turned slightly toward her, not to initiate connection, but to guide the next movement, because even now, structure remained. They moved together, not as partners, but as figures fulfilling a role. The guests adjusted, their attention following, their awareness sharp. Scarlett felt it fully now, not pressure, exposure, because the moment she became his wife, she became visible, not just to those inside the room, but to those outside it. And outside was where the real danger existed. That was the emotional hook, because visibility is not always power. Sometimes it is vulnerability. Her gaze shifted briefly across the room, noticing details she had not allowed herself to focus on before. The observers, the ones who were not part of either family, the ones who did not belong to the structure she understood. Their presence was subtle, but intentional, and in that moment, she realized something critical. This wedding had not just been arranged for protection. It had been arranged to send a message to someone, somewhere, a declaration, a claim. Scarlet Hayes was no longer available to be taken. She belonged to Dante Moretti's world now, and anything within that world was not easily touched. But being untouchable came with a cost, because those who could not reach you directly find other ways. Scarlett's final realization settled with sharp clarity as she stood within the space that no longer felt like a ceremony, but transitioned into something far more complex. Because the moment she became his wife, she became more than protected. She became a target. And as the weight of that truth settled fully into place, aligning everything she had stepped into with everything she had yet to face, one undeniable reality remained. The moment she became his wife, she became the target of his enemies. She thought the deadline was about debt, but it was about danger. The shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded, quietly, strategically. Scarlet Hayes had already stepped into a life she did not choose, but she had done so with clarity. She understood the contract, the structure, the limitations placed around her. She understood that her marriage to Dante Moretti was not built on emotion, but on necessity. What she had not understood was why the necessity existed in the first place. That was the intellectual hook. Because the truth behind a decision is always more dangerous than the decision itself. The Moretti estate did not resemble her former home. Where the Hayes estate had been built to display legacy, this one was designed for control. Security was not visible, but it was present in every corner. Movement was observed, not restricted, but never unnoticed. Scarlett adapted quickly, because adaptation was survival. Days had passed since the wedding, not long enough to settle, but enough to recognize patterns, enough to notice that Dante's behavior remained consistent. He did not interfere unnecessarily. He did not impose authority through force. He did not attempt to create closeness where none existed, but he did something else. He observed, constantly, and observation was a form of control. Scarlett stood near one of the large windows overlooking the distant skyline, her posture composed, her thoughts aligned. She had been reviewing the contract again, not because she expected to find something new, but because she understood something now. The truth was not written clearly. It was embedded, between the lines, behind the intention. Her gaze shifted slightly as footsteps approached, not rushed, not hesitant. Familiar. Dante. He stopped a few steps away, not entering her space, but close enough to shift the atmosphere. "You've been reviewing it again," he said. Not a question, a statement. Scarlett did not turn immediately. "Yes." Her voice remained calm, but it carried something new. Focus. Dante remained silent for a moment, as if allowing her the space to continue. And she did. This wasn't just about debt. She turned now, her gaze meeting his directly, not questioning, confirming. Dante's expression did not change, but his silence answered her. That was the emotional hook, because silence is often the clearest confirmation of a hidden truth. Scarlett stepped closer, her movements measured, her awareness sharp. "There was a deadline," she continued, "not a financial one, a strategic one." Dante did not interrupt, because interruption would mean denial, and denial was not necessary here. "You didn't need the marriage to fix the debt," she said. A pause, brief, but you needed it to stop something else. Now, the space between them shifted, not visibly, but internally, because she had reached the truth. And truth changes everything. Dante exhaled slowly, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady. Yes, one word, simple, but it redefined everything she thought she knew. Scarlett absorbed it instantly, because now the structure made sense. The urgency, the pressure, the lack of negotiation. None of it had been about saving her family from collapse. It had been about preventing something worse. "What was coming?" she asked. Her tone remained controlled, but beneath it was intensity. Dante held her gaze for a moment longer before responding. "Your family was being targeted." The statement landed sharply, because it carried weight beyond finance. Scarlett's expression didn't break, but internally, everything aligned. "By who?" Dante did not hesitate. "A group that doesn't negotiate," he said. They take. The simplicity of his words made them more dangerous, because people who take do not ask permission. That was the intellectual hook, because the real threat is never the one you see. It's the one already moving before you realize it exists. Scarlett's thoughts moved quickly now, connecting everything she had experienced over the past days. The contract, the speed of the marriage, the complete removal of her family's financial exposure. This was not protection offered randomly. This was protection positioned in advance. They were going to take everything, she said. Not a question. Dante nodded slightly. Yes. And the marriage, she paused, blocked them. Dante's gaze remained steady. Yes. The confirmation settled deeply, because now she understood the full structure. Legally, strategically, powerfully. By marrying her, Dante had not just tied her to him. He had tied her family assets into his system. And anything within his system was protected, not by law alone, but by power. That was the emotional hook. Because sometimes protection doesn't come from safety. It comes from becoming untouchable. Scarlett stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in realization. So this wasn't about helping my family, she said. Dante didn't respond immediately, because the truth was layered. It was about controlling the outcome, he said finally. Not denial, not correction, clarification. Scarlett's gaze sharpened, and I was part of that outcome. Dante didn't deny it. Yes. The word was quiet, but absolute. Scarlett turned away slightly, her thoughts no longer steady, but structured in a different way, because now she understood something deeper. She had not been saved. She had been positioned, used by both sides. Her family had pushed her into the marriage, and Dante had accepted it, not to save her, but to secure control. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous place to stand is between two sides that both benefit from your sacrifice. Her breathing remained even, her posture controlled. But internally, something had shifted permanently, because this was no longer about obligation. It was about truth. Did my father know? She asked. The question was quiet, but heavy. Dante's silence lasted longer this time. Not hesitation. Consideration. Yes. The answer came finally, and it changed everything, because that meant her father had not just hidden the debt. He had hidden the danger. He had known what was coming, and instead of telling her, he had pushed her into the solution. That was the intellectual hook, because betrayal is not always about lying. Sometimes it's about choosing what truth to hide. Scarlett closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to align, because emotion would not help her now. Only clarity would. When she opened them again, her gaze was different, not uncertain, not reactive, aware, completely. I wasn't given a choice, she said quietly. Dante didn't respond, because the statement was true, and neither option was freedom. Again, no denial, because there wasn't one. Scarlett stepped forward again, her presence stronger now, more defined. Tell me something honestly, she said. Dante's gaze remained fixed on hers. Were you protecting me or using me? The question hung between them, heavy, unavoidable, and for the first time, there was a slight shift in him, not visible to most, but real, because this question had no simple answer. Both, he said finally, the truth, unfiltered, and that was the most dangerous answer of all. Scarlett absorbed it completely, because honesty like that cannot be ignored. She turned away slowly, her thoughts no longer conflicted, because now everything was clear. The deadline, the marriage, the urgency. None of it had been about saving her life as she knew it. It had been about preventing something worse, something she had never even seen coming. And as that realization settled fully into place, aligning every decision, every moment, every hidden truth into one undeniable conclusion, she understood the reality she had been placed inside. She didn't marry him to save her family. She married him because someone wanted her destroyed. The ring on her finger didn't make her safe. It made her visible. The moment the ceremony ended, the illusion of stillness disappeared. What felt contained within the walls of that private space began to expand outward, quietly but rapidly, like a signal traveling through unseen channels. Scarlet Hayes, now legally bound to Dante Moretti, had not simply changed her name, she had changed her position. And in Dante's world, position determined everything. That was the intellectual hook. Because in a world built on power, being seen is not protection, it is exposure. The transition was immediate. There was no moment of adjustment, no space to process what had just happened. Scarlet did not return to her previous life, nor was she allowed to linger in the space between identities. She was moved strategically, efficiently, into Dante's environment, a place that did not resemble a home. It resembled a structure. The estate stood isolated from the outside world, surrounded not just by physical barriers, but by layers of control that extended far beyond what could be seen. Security was not obvious, but it was absolute. Movement was monitored. Access was restricted. Every entrance, every corridor, every interaction existed within a system that had been perfected over time. Scarlet noticed it immediately, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was precise. And precision reveals intention. She stepped into the space with the same controlled composure she had carried throughout the night, but internally, something had shifted. This was no longer about surviving a decision. This was about surviving its consequences. That was the emotional hook. Because some choices don't end when they're made, they begin there. Her presence inside the estate did not go unnoticed. It couldn't, because someone like Dante Moretti did not bring anyone into his world without it being observed, not just by his people, but by those who watch him from the outside. And now, they were watching her. Scarlet felt it before she understood it fully. Not direct threats, not visible danger, but awareness, the kind that exists when attention has shifted toward you in a way that cannot be reversed. Staff moved around her with quiet efficiency, their behavior respectful, controlled, but distant. No one treated her improperly, but no one treated her personally either, because in this world, roles were clear, and hers had just been defined. Dante's wife, a title that carried weight, but also risk. That was the intellectual hook, because titles in powerful systems are not just positions, they are targets. Dante did not stay beside her constantly. In fact, he did the opposite. His presence remained close enough to control the environment, but distant enough to maintain structure. He did not hover. He did not offer unnecessary reassurance. He observed, calculated, adjusted. Scarlet began to notice it quickly, because she had already learned something critical about him. He did not speak more than necessary, which meant his actions were his language, and those actions were deliberate. Security around her increased subtly but consistently, not in a way that restricted her movement visibly, but in a way that ensured she was never unprotected. Guards positioned themselves at distances that seemed casual, but were anything but. Surveillance existed without being intrusive. Every path she took was already accounted for. Every space she entered, already secured. Scarlet recognized the pattern immediately, because this was not about comfort. This was about control. And control meant something was wrong. That was the emotional hook, because protection only becomes intense when danger is already close. She moved through the estate slowly, observing everything, processing without reacting. Her posture remained composed, her expression neutral, but internally, her awareness expanded, because she understood something now. This world did not operate on emotion, it operated on threat. And if she was being protected this carefully, then she was already part of it. Dante appeared again later, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with presence that shifted the space instantly. Scarlet did not turn toward him immediately, because reacting was not her strategy anymore. She waited, and when she did face him, her expression did not change, but her understanding had. He did not ask how she was. He did not offer explanations. Instead, he simply adjusted something near her, a detail so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. A shift in positioning, a correction in distance. But Scarlet saw it, because now she was paying attention, and that was when she understood something deeper. He wasn't just protecting her. He was managing her exposure. That was the intellectual hook. Because real protection is not about keeping someone safe. It is about controlling what reaches them. Scarlett's gaze followed the movement around them, noticing how others responded to him without instruction. Subtle shifts, silent acknowledgments, unspoken coordination. This was not just authority. This was influence built over time. And she had just been placed inside it. But influence creates enemies, and enemies adapt. The first sign came quietly, not loud, not obvious, a message that never reached her directly, but reached him. Scarlett saw the shift in Dante before she understood the cause. His posture didn't change. His expression didn't break. But something beneath it tightened, a calculation, a response forming. And within seconds, the environment adjusted. Security increased again, not drastically, not visibly, but enough to confirm something. They were no longer just being watched. They were being approached. That was the emotional hook, because danger does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it moves quietly until it is already close. Scarlett felt it fully now. Not fear, clarity, because she had spent enough time observing to understand the system she was now inside. And that system was responding to something external, something real. Her gaze moved back to Dante, studying him not as a husband, but as a force within this environment, because that was what he was. Not emotional, not reactive, strategic. And in that strategy, she began to see something else. He had expected this, not the exact moment, but the outcome, which meant this was never just about her family's debt. This was about positioning, blocking, preventing something from happening. And now that something was pushing back, Scarlett's understanding deepened with sharp clarity, because the marriage was not just protection. It was a move in a larger game, and she was now part of that game, whether she wanted to be or not. That was the intellectual hook, because sometimes survival means realizing you were placed on the board long before you knew the game had started. She stepped slightly closer, not out of comfort, not out of trust, but out of necessity, because distance was no longer safety. Not here, not anymore. Dante did not look at her immediately, but he was aware, always, and that awareness was constant. Scarlett understood something then. Being beside him was the safest position available, but it was also the most visible one, and visibility invites attack. Her final realization settled with quiet intensity as everything aligned around her, the structure, the control, the silent threats moving closer with every calculated step, because the place she had been brought into for protection was not a shield, it was a battlefield, and the person standing at its center was now her, because the safest place beside him was becoming the most dangerous place to stand. The man who took her freedom became the only one fighting for it. The tension that had settled around Scarlett Hayes did not disappear. It evolved. What once felt like fear had started turning into something more complicated. Not comfort, not trust, not yet, but awareness. And awareness changed everything. Scarlett had entered Dante Moretti's world believing he was the cage, the man who accepted her sacrifice, the man who turned her family's crisis into a marriage contract, the man who stood beside her at midnight without emotion, without apology, without pretending the arrangement was anything softer than control. But now, she was beginning to understand something she had missed. Dante had not created the danger. He had stepped between her and it. That was the intellectual hook. Because sometimes the person who looks like the threat is only the one standing closest to it. The estate remained guarded, controlled, and silent. Every hallway carried purpose. Every closed door suggested decisions happening beyond her reach. Scarlett still felt watched, still felt contained, still felt the invisible boundaries around her. But now, she was reading those boundaries differently. Before, every guard had looked like a restriction. Now, she noticed their angles. One near the western corridor, one by the glass doors, two near the rear entrance. Another position where he could see the staircase without being seen clearly himself. They were not placed to trap her. They were placed to protect her line of movement. That realization did not make her feel safe. It made her think, because safety and control looked almost identical in Dante's world. The difference was intention, and intention was what Scarlett had begun to study. Dante rarely explained himself. He didn't ask for her trust, didn't soften his words, didn't pretend their marriage had become something personal. His distance remained intact, but his actions told a different story. He adjusted routes before she walked them. He ended conversations before they reached her. He placed himself near danger without making it look like protection. And every time the air shifted around them, he noticed before anyone else did. Scarlett began to see the pattern. He was not careless. He was not cruel. He was prepared. That was the emotional hook, because protection does not always arrive as warmth. Sometimes it arrives as silence, distance, and someone watching the door before you even know it exists. Her family's betrayal became clearer with every passing hour. Richard Hayes had called it necessity. He had made the marriage sound like sacrifice of the family name, the business, the estate, the future. But the more Scarlett understood, the more she saw what he had truly done. He had protected the Hayes legacy. Not her. He had hidden the danger, hidden the full truth, hidden the fact that the threat had already reached their door long before she was given the ultimatum. And when the pressure became too great, he handed her to Dante as the solution. That truth settled deeper than anger. It created distance, not physical distance, emotional distance from everything she once believed was hers. Her family, her home, her place in a life she thought she understood. All of it had been conditional. Dante's world was dangerous, yes, but at least its danger was honest. Her family's world had smiled while placing her on the edge of collapse. That contrast disturbed her more than she wanted to admit, because it meant the man she had feared most had been more truthful than the people she had trusted most. Scarlett stood near the library window, watching daylight spread across the estate grounds. The brightness outside did not soften the tension inside. Nothing in Dante's world softened easily. Behind her, the door opened. She did not turn immediately. She already knew who it was. Dante entered with the same controlled presence that seemed to change the room without effort. He stopped several steps away, close enough to speak, far enough not to crowd her. That distance, she noticed now, was deliberate. He gave her space. Not freedom, but space. And in her current life, even that mattered. "They'll try again," he said. No greeting, no comfort, only truth. Scarlett turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "The people after my family." Dante's expression remained unreadable. "The people after you." The correction landed heavily, because it removed the last layer of denial. This was no longer about assets, no longer about debt, no longer about the Hayes name. It was about her position, her marriage, her value inside the conflict. Scarlett's voice stayed steady. "And if I leave?" Dante did not answer immediately. That silence mattered, because he never delayed without reason. "If you leave alone," he said finally, "they won't need to fight through me to reach you." Simple, calm, brutal. Scarlett looked away for a moment, not because she couldn't handle the truth, but because she understood it too clearly. Running had seemed like freedom when she first entered his world. Now it looked like exposure, and exposure, in a game she barely understood, would destroy her. That was the intellectual hook, because escape is only freedom when you know what you're escaping into. Scarlett's fingers moved lightly against the ring on her hand. The metal felt colder than before, but its meaning had changed. At first, it had been a symbol of sacrifice, then a mark of control. Now, it was a shield, a dangerous one, a visible one, but still a shield. She hated that something forced on her could also be the reason she was alive. Hated that Dante's name protected her more effectively than her own ever had. Hated that every truth led her closer to the one person she still wasn't ready to trust. Dante watched her quietly, not pushing, not demanding, not claiming victory over her realization. That restraint unsettled her, because a controlling man would have used this moment. A cruel man would have reminded her that she needed him. Dante did neither. He simply stood there, waiting for her to reach the conclusion on her own. And that more than anything else, made her afraid, because trust was easier to resist when someone demanded it. It was harder when they earned it without asking. Scarlett's voice softened slightly, though her tone remained controlled. You knew my father was hiding the truth. Yes. You knew I would hate you for accepting the deal. Yes. And you still went through with it. Dante's gaze held hers. Yes. No defense. No explanation. No attempt to make himself look better. Just truth. Scarlett studied him carefully. Why? This time his answer came slower. Because if I refused, they would have taken everything before sunrise. The words settled between them. Cold, precise, final. Scarlett felt the truth of it, not because he made it emotional, but because he didn't. He wasn't trying to win her sympathy. He was giving her the shape of reality. And reality was crueler than he was. Her breath steadied. For the first time, she allowed herself to see him not as the man who stole her choice, but as a man who had acted within the little time left before every choice vanished completely. That did not absolve him. It did not make the marriage fair. It did not erase the pressure, but it changed the meaning. And meaning changes everything. Scarlett stepped away from the window, moving closer, but not enough to remove the distance completely. I still don't trust you. Dante's expression did not change. You shouldn't. The answer surprised her. Even though his voice remained calm, he continued, trust given too quickly is weakness. Scarlett held his gaze. And trust never given? Dante paused. Isolation. That answer stayed with her, because she understood isolation. She had felt it inside her own family, inside the contract, inside the wedding, inside every silent room where decisions were made about her without her consent. Isolation had not protected her. It had made her easier to move, easier to use, easier to sacrifice. Maybe that was the truth she feared most. Not that she needed Dante, but that being alone had never made her free. It had only made her vulnerable. That was the emotional hook. Because the hardest thing about trust is admitting that survival alone may not be survival at all. Scarlett looked at him for a long moment. He was still dangerous, still calculated, still a man whose world could swallow hers completely. But he was also consistent. And consistency, in a life suddenly filled with betrayal, had become something she could not ignore. Her voice came quieter. If I stay beside you, I become part of your world. Yes. And if I run, I become prey. Dante did not soften the answer. Yes. There it was. The truth stripped down to its simplest form. Not comfort, not choice in the way she wanted, but clarity. And clarity was the first thing that had belonged to her since midnight. Scarlett straightened slightly, her posture no longer defensive in the same way. She was not surrendering. She was thinking, choosing how to survive inside a reality she had not created. That was different. And for the first time, Dante's silence did not feel like control. It felt like space. Space for her to decide what kind of woman she would become inside this new world. Not a victim, not a pawn, not merely his wife. Something stronger, something aware, something harder to use. She looked down at the ring again, then back at him. I won't belong to you. Dante's gaze remained steady. No. The answer came without hesitation, and that made her pause, because she had expected possession, control, a claim. But he gave none. You belong to the decision you make next, he said. The words were calm, but they landed with weight, because they gave back something she had thought was gone. Not freedom, not fully, but ownership of the next step. Scarlett felt the shift inside her. Small, dangerous, real. She did not trust him yet, but she understood him. And understanding was the beginning of something she could not name. Maybe alliance, maybe survival, maybe the kind of trust that formed not from tenderness, but from standing inside danger and realizing who was shielding the impact. The estate remained silent around them, but beyond its walls, enemies were moving. Her family had failed her. Her old life had collapsed. The future she thought she knew had vanished before midnight. And now, there was only this, Dante's world, her choice, and the dangerous line between the two. Scarlett's final realization settled with quiet force, because trusting him might be the only way to survive. But survival with Dante Moretti would never come without a price. And as the silence between them deepened into something sharper, more dangerous, and far more complicated than fear, one truth remained. Trusting Dante could save her, or make her belong to his world forever. Heading 8. The choice after the vows. She was forced to marry him, but staying beside him became her own decision. The silence between Scarlett Hayes and Dante Moretti did not feel empty anymore. It felt defined. What once held uncertainty, fear, and resistance had now transformed into something far more complex, clarity. Not the kind that made her comfortable, but the kind that made her aware. And awareness was power. That was the intellectual hook. Because true freedom does not come from escaping a situation. It comes from understanding it enough to control your place within it. Scarlett stood still, but internally, everything had shifted. She was no longer reacting to events as they unfolded around her. She was observing them, processing them, and for the first time since that midnight ultimatum, she was thinking ahead, not as a victim, as a participant. Her gaze remained steady as she looked at Dante, no longer searching for weakness in him, no longer resisting his presence out of instinct alone. Now, she was evaluating him, the man she had feared, the man she had blamed, the man she had married under pressure. He was still all those things, but he was also something else. Consistent, predictable in a way that mattered, and in a world where everyone else had hidden their intentions. That consistency held value. Scarlett understood something now that she hadn't allowed herself to see before. Dante had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. Her family had. That realization did not erase the reality of her situation, but it redefined it, because now she could see where the real lines were drawn. That was the emotional hook, because the moment you stop asking why something happened and start asking what you can do with it, you take your power back. Scarlett took a slow step forward, not toward him, toward the decision, because that was what this moment truly was, not a continuation of the past, a point of control. Dante did not interrupt her thoughts. He did not guide her. He did not push her toward any outcome. He simply remained where he was, watching, calculating, waiting, because he understood something important. A forced decision creates resistance. A chosen decision creates loyalty. And right now, this had to be hers. Scarlett's voice came steady, but different than before. Not defensive, not uncertain. Clear, I won't go back. The statement carried weight, not just in what it said, but in what it meant. She was not talking about the estate. She was talking about everything. Her family, her old life, the version of herself that had allowed others to decide her future. All of it was behind her now. Dante's gaze held hers, but he did not respond immediately because he recognized a shift. This was no longer a woman reacting to pressure. This was a woman defining her position. And that changed everything. Scarlett continued, her posture grounded, her presence steady. I won't be used again. The words were simple, but absolute, because they carried truth, not emotion, not anger. Truth. And truth is the most dangerous thing in a control world. That was the intellectual hook, because once someone understands how they were used, they become impossible to control the same way again. Dante stepped slightly closer, but not enough to close the space between them completely, because even now, distance mattered. Then, don't be, he said. No explanation, no strategy laid out for her, just acknowledgement, because he would not decide this for her. Scarlett studied him carefully. That answer was not what she expected. She had expected direction, control, a plan imposed on her. But instead, he gave her something else. Responsibility. And responsibility is heavier than control, because it means every outcome that follows belongs to you. Scarlett exhaled slowly, her thoughts aligning, her emotions no longer pulling her in different directions. Everything that had happened, the ultimatum, the marriage, the truth about her family, the danger surrounding her, it all led to this. A single realization. She could not undo what had been done, but she could decide what it meant next. That was the emotional hook, because power is not always about changing the past. Sometimes it's about refusing to let the past define your future. Scarlet lifted her gaze fully, her voice quieter now, but stronger. You said I have a choice. Dante nodded once. Yes. She held that moment, letting it settle, because choice had been taken from her before. But now it had been returned, not in the way she would have chosen, but real enough to matter. If I stay, she said slowly, it won't be because I have nowhere else to go. Dante did not interrupt. Because this was a decision. It will be because I choose to. The words landed with precision, clear, defined, unshakable, and in that moment, the balance between them shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally, because she was no longer standing inside his world as someone placed there. She was standing there as someone who chose to remain. That was the power shift. Because the moment a forced position becomes a chosen one, it stops being control and starts becoming strategy. Dante saw it, recognized it instantly, because people like him understood power better than anyone else. And what Scarlet had just done was claim hers. You won't be controlled, he said quietly. Not a promise. A statement of understanding. Scarlet met his gaze. I won't allow it. And for the first time, there was no resistance between them, not because they trusted each other fully, but because they understood each other clearly. And understanding is the foundation of everything that follows. The room felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the dynamic had. Scarlet was no longer reacting to Dante's world. She was stepping into it with awareness, with intention, with control over her own role within it. And that made her dangerous in a way she had never been before, because now she could not be moved easily, not by her family, not by Dante, not by his enemies. That was the intellectual hook, because the most powerful position is not being protected. It is being aware enough to protect yourself. Scarlet turned slightly, her gaze moving across the space, seeing it differently now, not as a prison, as a field, a place where decisions would be made, where strategies would unfold, where outcomes would be determined, and she was no longer just standing inside it. She was part of it, actively, knowingly. Dante watched her without interruption, because now he no longer needed to guide her. She had already taken the step he had been waiting for, not obedience. Choice, and choice, is far more powerful than control. Scarlet's final words came without hesitation. I'll stand beside you, not behind, not under, beside. The distinction mattered, because it defined everything. Dante did not smile, did not soften, but something in his presence shifted slightly. Not emotion, recognition, because he understood exactly what that meant. She was no longer part of the deal. She was part of the strategy. And that changed everything. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, because the decision had been made, not by pressure, not by fear, but by choice. Scarlet Hayes had been forced into a marriage she did not want, but she had just chosen what came after it. And that choice was far more powerful than the vows that came before. Her final realization settled with absolute clarity, shaping everything that would come next, every decision, every consequence, every move she would make inside a world that once threatened to consume her, because now she understood it, and understanding is what changes outcomes. Because she was given one night to marry the Mafia boss. But what she chose after that changed everything.